Dry Creek Valley awakens to a test of legends. The sun had just begun to bleed light across the mesas of Dry Creek Valley when a voice clear, firm, and edged in steel cut through the morning stillness like the crack of a rifle. It wasn't the voice of a sheriff laying down the law or a preacher summoning souls. It was a widow Catherine Sterling, and what she offered wasn't just a challenge, it was a reckoning. Within hours, her words had traveled faster than dust. On the wind passed from hand to hand, saloon to saloon, till every man with a spine and a saddle heard about the black stallion and the $50 gauntlet she had thrown into the dirt. They said Catherine Sterling had fire in her eyes and grief etched into the lines of her face. She had buried her husband 3 winters ago after a long, slow war with consumption. Since then, she'd run the Sterling Ranch with a jaw set like granite and a stare that could silence a room. But her reputation wasn't just born from tragedy. It came from the horse, Tempest. A creature carved from shadow and thunder, 17 hands, high with eyes so black they looked like burnt coal polished to a mirror sheen. His coat shimmered like oil in sunlight. His breath misted like a forge in winter. And his soul, they said, was wilder than the plains before the first fence post. No one had ever ridden him. Not really. 25 men had tried. Rodeo stars with silver spurs, horse whisperers with smooth voices and softer hands. Farm boys who thought familiarity bred mastery. All of them had been thrown. Tempest didn't buck like a regular horse. He judged, and if he found a rider wanting, he tossed them from his back with a fury that was less animal and more elemental. Catherine wasn't looking for another fool with a rope and a swagger. She wasn't trying to humble men for sport. She was searching for something specific, a quality no resume could prove and no past ride could guarantee. She wanted the kind of cowboy her husband had been. The kind who didn't just sit a saddle but earned it. The kind who knew the difference between domination and partnership. Who understood that a horse like Tempest didn't need to be broken. He needed to be believed in. So she made her stand at the general store, the place where news rippled fastest. She raised her voice and offered her terms. 10 minutes. Stay on the horse without being thrown and the gold was yours. But fail, and you were to leave her ranch and never return. It wasn't just a test of strength. It was a test of character, and the woman offering it wasn't some desperate widow. She was a guardian of something sacred, a memory, a legacy, a standard no man had yet risen to meet. The parade of pretenders. By sundown, that same day, the first wave had arrived. They came with boots polished and eyes burning, drawn by the smell of gold and the chance to prove themselves. Dry Creek Valley hadn't seen this many horses tied to hitching posts since the last cattle drive, but these weren't drovers or ranch hands. These were men with something to prove, and not nearly enough to back it up. The local boys came first. Farm-raised and sun-weathered, they'd grown up thinking they understood horses because they'd been tossed onto the backs of plow mules and Sunday ponies since before they could spell their own names. They swaggered into the corral full of hometown pride and the kind of cockiness only youth could justify. They left bruised limping and, in one memorable case, crying for their mama through a mouthful of missing teeth. Next came the drifters, hardened men with leather faces and stories that smelled like whiskey and exaggeration. They wore their scars like badges and believed that pain was just another lesson waiting to be taught. But Tempest didn't recognize tall tales. He didn't care about how many saloons you'd brawled in or how many bulls you'd ridden. He sized you up in silence, then issued judgment in movement, quick, decisive, and humiliating. Finally, the so-called professionals arrived. Horse trainers from Santa Fe, rodeo champions from Kansas City. They came with names known from newspaper clippings and calluses earned in arenas. Some brought gadgets, special bridles, nosebands, even elaborate contraptions that looked more suited to a science fair than a corral. One even arrived with a gramophone, insisting he'd tamed a Mustang to the sound of Brahms. Tempest was unimpressed. Each man had a theory. Fear him into submission. Bribe him with treats. Outthink him with tricks. But the Stallion wasn't interested in being a prize to win or a riddle to solve. He'd learned long ago that men didn't come to understand. They came to conquer, and for that he had no patience. By week's end, the town doctor had treated 3 dislocated shoulders, 5 sets of cracked ribs, and a concussion or 2. The saloon kept its piano quiet out of respect for the moaning men laid out on cots, nursing egos more injured than their bones. And still they kept coming. Word had spread far beyond the valley now. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about glory, about the legend of a horse that couldn't be ridden and the woman who dared you to try, the memory of her husband and the real standard. Behind every challenge Catherine Sterling issued was a memory too sacred to speak aloud more than once. She remembered it like scripture etched not in words, but in motion and light. It had been 3 winters past the day before her husband died. The fever was already inside him, eating away with a quiet hunger that neither medicine nor prayer could stop. But that morning, he'd risen from bed like a man with purpose, said nothing, just pulled on his boots, buttoned his coat, and walked barefoot into the cold. She had followed silent and afraid as he approached the corral. Tempest was already there, watching muscles taut as if sensing something more than the usual. And thence, without rope or bridle, her husband stepped inside. No one else was there, no crowd, no timer, no gold. Just a dying man and a creature too wild for logic. What happened next stayed burned into her memory with a vividness that never faded. The Stallion let him climb aboard. No rearing, no bucking. Just stillness like the valley itself held its breath. And then they moved slow, then faster in circles so smooth they felt more like wind than hooves. Man and horse danced to music no one else could hear. For 10 minutes they moved like one, like the spirit of the land had taken form. When he dismounted, his fever, bright eyes had met hers, and he whispered, "That horse knows things, Catherine. He's not waiting to be broken. He's waiting to be understood." That was the bar she had set. Not showmanship, not grit, not brute force. She was waiting for the kind of soul who could meet Tempest in that silent language of shared wounds and mutual respect. A kind of knowing that had nothing to do with reins and everything to do with recognition. So when people called her cruel or worse, delusional, she never flinched. They hadn't seen what she had seen. They hadn't heard the music. She wasn't punishing men. She was waiting for the one man who could carry the ghost of her husband's ride forward, who could prove that kind of bond wasn't just a fluke of fever and farewell, but a possibility waiting for the right heart to come along. Jake Morrison, a man on the edge of himself. Miles from Dry Creek Valley, in a shack stitched together from old pine and rusted nails, Jake Morrison stared into a fire that had almost gone out. The embers pulsed softly, throwing just enough light to remind him he was still there, still breathing, still caught in a life that had shrunk down to chores and silence. The wind outside howled through the gaps in the walls, as if trying to tell him something he'd long stopped listening for. Out here, past the cattle fences and forgotten trails, Jake had become a ghost in his own life, useful, solitary, fading. He worked the line shacks for the double bar, doctoring sick calves, checking fence posts, riding long stretches of land that most ranchers didn't even remember they owned. His only regular company was a steady bay gelding named Copper, who seemed to understand that sometimes a man needed to ride without speaking. Jake had been living like this for years, long enough that the rhythm of isolation felt more familiar than anything else. He saw people once a month, maybe less. Long enough to trade for coffee and hardtack, long enough to nod at someone who might remember his name. Then back to the solitude. He hadn't always been like this. Once before the war, Jake had been different. Before he'd watched the worst parts of men take form in gunpowder and screams. Before he'd learned that sometimes in order to keep breathing you had to forget what it meant to feel. He had come home to a world that felt too loud, too false. So he left it, found the quietest corner of it he could, and yet lately something had begun to shift. Not loudly, not suddenly, but in the small forgotten hours between midnight and dawn. Something inside him whispered not words but weight, restlessness. The kind that didn't come from boredom, but from something more essential. He couldn't name it, but it moved through him like wind through prairie grass. Then came the story. Drifted in with a merchant on a muddy wagon. Rode out on a trail hand's lips between gulps of beer. A black stallion. A woman with steel for a spine. A challenge that had broken 25 men and waited still unmet. At first, Jake had dismissed it. He wasn't interested in fool's errands or broken ribs. But the story stuck. The image of that horse. The sound of hooves against dust. A challenge, yes, but not just of muscle. Maybe it was the way it was told. Like it wasn't about winning. Like it was about something else. And maybe Jake Morrison was ready to stop running from ghosts and start riding towards something, even if it meant risking what little of himself he had left. The long ride and the unseen. Pratipur. At first light, Jake saddled Copper with practiced hands and quiet resolve. He didn't pack much, just coffee-dried meat, a bedroll, and a rope halter that had seen better days. The sky was still dark enough to hold stars, but the eastern horizon was beginning to bleed orange. As Copper snorted and shifted beneath him, Jake took one last look at the line shack, its sagging walls and cold hearth, and whispered a goodbye he didn't expect to say out loud. The ride to Dry Creek Valley wasn't short, but Jake wasn't in a hurry. The land changed beneath his hooves, the way time changes a man, subtle, gradual, undeniable. Open plains gave way to broken mesas, the rocks jutting up like the bones of the earth. Shallow creeks traced the path forward like veins. Cottonwoods stood like sentinels along the water, whispering in the wind. It was country that required respect and offered none in return, unless you earned it. As the morning turned to afternoon, Jake began to hear it before he saw it. A sound that didn't belong to cattle or wagons or men. A sound like thunder wrapped in flesh. Even from half a mile away, the stallion's fury carried across the valley. A snort, a crash, the pound of hooves against packed earth. And in that sound, Jake felt something stir in him that had lain dormant for years. Not fear, Not even anticipation, recognition. As if something wild inside him had heard its name for the first time in a long time. When he crested the final ridge and looked down into the Sterling Ranch, he saw a place carved by intention. Fences followed the land's natural curve, not against it. Outbuildings faced the sun like sunflowers. The corral sat at the heart of it all, center stage to something sacred. Jake slowed Copper, letting him pick his way down the trail, breathing in the scent of grass, wood smoke, and something deeper. Possibility. A crowd had gathered. Another man, fancy gear. Loud Boots was already in the corral. Jake dismounted near the barn, tied Copper to a post, and leaned against the rail. He watched as Tempest moved like no other horse he'd seen. Not just powerful, but precise, controlled, intelligent, a creature who didn't just react, he chose. And when he bucked that proud fool into the dirt, it wasn't rage. It was clarity, a rejection of arrogance, a demand for something real. Jake didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. And in that stillness he knew. He wasn't here for a show. He was here because something inside him had been echoing for years. And now finally it had found an answer. The first meeting. Eyes that weigh a man's soul. She stood on the porch like the land belonged to her, not because she'd claimed it, but because she'd earned it. Catherine Sterling. The name hung in the air heavier than smoke. She wasn't dressed for theatrics. Her clothes were practical. Her stance still. But her eyes, those gray-blue eyes, met Jake's across the corral, with a gaze so steady, so searching, it made him feel as if she were reading chapters of his life he hadn't meant anyone to see. "Are you here to try your luck with my horse?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying like a bell in still air. Jake tipped his hat out of respect. "Thinking about it, ma'am." She studied him. Really studied him, not the way people assess strength or worth, but the way a blacksmith tests metal. Quietly, intently. Measuring heat and weight and the possibility of what could be forged. She saw the weathering in his clothes, the smooth rhythm in how he moved around Copper. She saw the absence of boasting, the kind of man who didn't speak unless he had something to say. "What makes you different from the others?" she asked. Jake paused. It would have been easy to reach for a line. But he didn't come here for easy. "Can't say that I am different," he answered. "But I'm not here to prove anything. Not to you, not to the crowd, not even to myself. I'm just here to see if that horse and I might find some common ground." Something shifted in her, then a small softening, barely visible like the first thaw of frost. She descended the porch with grace born, from work, not vanity, and walked toward him with a hand extended. "What's your name, cowboy? Jake Morrison?" Their handshake was brief but firm. Her hand was calloused, real, like her. "My husband could ride that horse," she said. "Only man who ever could." "You know why?" Jake glanced toward the Stallion. "I'd guess it's because he didn't try to break him." "That's part of it." She nodded. "But there's more." He understood that real strength comes from knowing when to yield, that trust is earned, not taken. She wasn't just talking about horses anymore. Jake felt it, and for the first time in a long time he wanted to listen. Dance of trust. Man and Stallion. Jake approached the corral with a slowness that wasn't hesitation, it was intention. He moved like a man who knew every step mattered, that every sound he made would be read and translated by the creature inside the fence. He didn't swing a leg over the top rail, didn't shout, didn't whistle. Instead, he leaned on the fence post and waited silent as a prayer. Tempest was already watching. The stallion stood in the center of the corral, head-high, legs planted like roots. His coat shimmered under the late afternoon sun, blacker than night and glistening like wet obsidian. His nostrils flared, catching scent and story. His ears twitched, picking up signals most men never knew they were sending. Jake didn't move, didn't reach, just stood letting the wind braid between them whatever ancient language animals and honest men still spoke. "Easy there, partner," he murmured, voice no louder than breath. "I'm not here to conquer." Tempest flicked an air. They stood like that for a while, two figures measuring one another, not in terms of power, but in potential. Jake had seen what happened to those who came in, loud came in, fast, came in full of pride and rope tricks. The corral still carried the scuffs of their failures, the air still heavy with the ghost of their arrogance. But Jake had learned long ago that trust could not be summoned like a dog. It had to be earned. Slowly, softly. Catherine watched from a few feet behind, arms folded but her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, nostalgic. "My husband used to talk to him just like that. Said horses could hear the truth in a man's voice, especially when the man himself had forgotten what truth sounded like." Jake didn't turn his head, but her words sank in deep. He didn't need to say he understood. Tempest already knew. The stallion took a step forward, then another, stopped, snorted. Jake didn't reach out, just nodded slightly, a silent thank you for the trust. "This ain't about force," Jake said under his breath. "Ain't even about winning. It's about seeing if you and me got something worth sharing." The horse came closer, not close enough to touch, just close enough to choose. That was enough for now. The mount, becoming one with the wild time, expanded like slow-moving clouds over the prairie. Jake didn't rush. He let Tempest circle him in the corral, always keeping one eye on the stallion, one hand loose at his side, not to control, but to stay open. The crowd outside the fence had gone quiet, sensing that something different was happening. This wasn't a show, it was a conversation. Tempest moved with the silent grace of something born wild and sharpened by disappointment. Jake could see the old scars along his flank, faint now, but undeniable. Reminders of the men who had tried to turn him into a beast of burden. Jake didn't pity the stallion. He understood him. He'd seen those same scars in the mirror, only his weren't on the skin. "Not here to take," Jake whispered. "Not here to fix. Just here." Finally, Tempest came close enough to breathe on his hand. Jake kept still. The horse exhaled warm, slow, steady. Not a greeting, not an invitation. More like a question. "You," Jake answered without words. He placed his hand gently on Tempest's neck, the muscles beneath twitching once but not pulling away. The contact was electric, not from fear, but from memory. A memory shared by two beings who have been alone too long. "You ready for this?" Catherine's voice broke through from the fence line, full of something between hope and fear. Jake didn't answer her directly. Instead, he spoke to the stallion. "I've been ready for this my whole life. Just didn't know it." He moved to Tempest's left side slowly, always touching, always asking. When he finally slid his makeshift stirrup onto the horse's back, the stallion tensed but did not move. Jake breathed deep, waited. When the tension passed, he mounted not like a man taking control, but like a man joining something sacred. Tempest didn't flinch. The crowd at the fence held its breath. And then step, a single stride, then another. The corral blurred at the edges. Jake no longer felt the sun or the eyes watching, just the rhythm beneath him, powerful and balanced. They moved together, not as horse and rider, as partners. 10 minutes that changed everything. They started slow. A walk just enough to feel each other's rhythm. Jake adjusted his seat by instinct. Tempest adjusted his pace the same way. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. It was intimate, like two souls exchanging names in a language older than words. Outside the corral, no one spoke. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Catherine leaned forward on the fence rail, eyes wide with the kind of hope that hurts. She looked at the sun, then at the clock someone had brought out. 6 minutes. Inside, Tempest shifted gears. The walk became a trot, smooth, effortless, like water finding its current. Jake followed the movement, let himself be carried. This wasn't control. It was trust in action. His hands relaxed, reins loose, legs steady. He didn't steer. He guided. And the horse responded not like something tamed, but like something finally seen. 8 minutes. Then, without cue or warning, Tempest launched into a canter. Not wild. Not testing. Free. Jake's breath caught in his throat, but not from fear. From awe. The speed, the grace, the joy. Tempest wasn't performing. He was celebrating. The fence blurred into streaks of wood and shadow. Jake leaned into the turns, moved with the stallion, each shift of weight answered by a stride, a breath, a moment of perfect alignment. 10 minutes. Catherine called the time, but it barely registered. This wasn't about clocks. It wasn't even about gold. It was about belonging. Tempest slowed on his own terms, gliding from canter to trot, to walk to stillness. He stopped in the center of the corral, exactly where they had begun. Jake sat in silence, heart thundering. Tempest's breath rose in soft clouds, and for the first time in years, Jake felt whole. 15 minutes had passed, and everything had changed. Keep the gold. The hush that fell over the corral wasn't silence, it was reverence. A kind of quiet reserved for sacred places and once-in-a-lifetime moments. Jake sat still in the saddle, not because he didn't know what to do next, but because he didn't want to break the fragile magic still hanging between him and the stallion beneath him. Tempest, for his part, stood with ears pricked forward and head high, but not tense. He was calm, grounded. The coiled energy of the ride had settled into something new, peace. Catherine approached slowly, her boots crunching in the dirt like the first sounds in a world just made. She stepped into the corral without hesitation, as if crossing some invisible threshold between test and truth. In her hand, she held a leather pouch. The $50 prize promised to any man who could last 10 minutes on the back of Tempest. "You rode him for 15, she said quietly. Jake blinked. The numbers barely registered. Time had melted somewhere between the first step and the last turn, between the shift in Tempest's gait and the moment their breathing synced. He looked at the pouch, then at her, and finally back at the horse. Tempest turned his head slightly, eyeing Jake the way a friend might, wary, curious, open. "This wasn't about the money," Jake said, voice soft. Catherine nodded once, as if she already knew the answer, but she offered the pouch anyway out of respect. Jake looked down at it, then back at her again. "Keep it," he repeated. Catherine's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't argue. Instead, she closed her fingers around the pouch and slipped it back into her coat. The gesture wasn't rejection, it was recognition. An understanding passed between them like wind over wheat. "So, what was it about?" she asked. Jake took a deep breath. His hand drifted to Tempest's neck, resting there gently like anchoring himself to something real. "Finding something I didn't even know I was looking for," he said. The words hung in the air, between them raw and unfinished. Catherine studied him for a long moment. Then slowly, she smiled. Not the kind of smile people give when something amusing happens, but the kind that slips out when your heart starts remembering how to feel again. And in that smile, Jake saw not just thanks, but the first shimmer of something more: recognition, of a man who hadn't come to win but had nonetheless arrived. "Do you have somewhere to be?" The crowd had mostly drifted away by then, whispering in awe, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others already reweaving the story into legend. But Jake barely noticed them. His world had narrowed to the woman before him, the stallion beside him, and the corral that had somehow become holy ground. Catherine looked up at him again, eyes still gray-blue and deep as canyon shadows. "Do you have somewhere you need to be?" She asked, the words gentle, but weighted with something that had nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with invitation. Jake looked out across the Sterling Ranch, across the ordered rows of fencing, the line of cottonwoods by the creek, the barn with its worn doors and hand-forged hinges. This was a place built with intention, held together not just by nails and wire, but by grit, grief, and grace. Then he thought of his line shack, the sagging porch, the cold stove, the silence. "No, ma'am," he said. "Can't say that I do." Catherine nodded like she'd already known the answer. "The Double Bar Ranch, won't they, monsieur?" Jake's smile was faint, tired, but real. "They'll find someone else. They always do." The moment stretched. The last of the watchers had gone, and only the horses, the setting sun, and the sound of breeze rustling dry leaves remained. Catherine studied him again, but this time not with skepticism or assessment, with hope. "I could use help around here," she said finally. "Running a place this size alone, it's more than one person ought to handle." Jake didn't answer right away. He waited, knowing there was more. "There's a cabin out by the north pasture," she added. "Solid bones, needs a man's hands on it." Jake nodded slowly, taking it in, weighing the offer, not in terms of labor or pay, but purpose. "One condition," she said. "What's that?" Tempest comes with the job. Jake glanced at the stallion who had been grazing lazily by the fence, now lifting his head at the sound of his name. He came closer as if summoned not by command, but by connection. Jake reached out, and the stallion nudged his shoulder with the weight of familiarity. "Think you might be interested in that kind of partnership?" Catherine asked. Jake smiled, small, steady, true. "Yes, ma'am, I believe I might be very interested in that." Seasons of change. A new kind of life. The months that followed passed like the slow bloom of spring across a stubborn landscape, quiet, gradual, and filled with the kind of beauty that sneaks up on you when you're not looking. Jake moved into the cabin near the north pasture, and though it had sat empty for years, it welcomed him like it had been waiting. He cleaned the chimney, fixed the hinges, repaired the sagging porch. By the end of the first week, the place already felt less like a shelter and more like a home. Every morning, the windows filled with sunlight that rose golden over the eastern ridge. And every evening Jake sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching Tempest graze in the distance, the stallion's coat catching the light like it held fire beneath the skin. The work suited him, not just the fencing and feeding and breeding charts. That was all familiar enough. But what surprised him was how good it felt. Not just to labor, but to matter. Catherine gave him responsibilities, trusted his judgment, let him make decisions not as a hired hand, but as a partner. And then there was Tempest. The stallion became more than a symbol of pride or defiance. He became a mirror, a creature who reflected Jake's strengths and flaws alike. They rode together across the valley, Jake often riding bareback with nothing more than a rope halter, sometimes without even that. There were moments when they moved as one thought as one. Catherine watched those rides from a distance, her heart quietly blooming with something that looked an awful lot like healing. But it wasn't just the work or the horse that changed Jake. It was the quiet moments. The shared coffee on Catherine's porch after a long day, the meals eaten by lamplight, the way conversations started about hay prices or saddle cinches and ended with stories from their pasts, spoken in tones softened by time. The way laughter rusty at first began to return, and the way silence no longer felt empty. Jake didn't say it aloud, not yet. But every nail driven, every field cleared, every ride taken with Tempest was a word in a new language he was learning to speak. A language called belonging. You found yourself. It was late summer when Catherine said it. The two of them sat on her front porch, the air still warm, but carrying the first faint scent of autumn in the grass. The sky stretched overhead in copper and rose, and the cottonwoods rustled like old paper. They sat in companionable silence, coffee mugs in hand, legs stretched out their shoulders close enough to brush, but still holding space. "I never thanked you properly," Catherine said suddenly, breaking the quiet with a voice full of meaning. Jake turned to her, puzzled. "For what?" She smiled, a quiet, almost wistful curve of her lips that deepened the lines beside her eyes. "For proving me right." He didn't know what she meant at first. She took a breath, eyes fixed on the horizon. "For 3 years, folks said I was crazy to keep that horse, that he was dangerous, that I was holding on to something I needed to let go of. But I knew he wasn't unrideable. Just misunderstood. Just waiting," Jake swallowed. "Waiting for the right rider." She nodded. Waiting for someone who didn't see him as a prize or a beast. Someone who saw him as he was. "You proved that was possible." Her voice trembled slightly just at the edge of vulnerability, and then she turned to him. "Sometimes the most worthwhile things in life are the ones you have to wait for, even when everyone tells you they'll never come." Jake set his mug down slowly. He knew she wasn't just talking about horses anymore. "Catherine," he said softly, turning to face her fully, "I need you to know something." She met his gaze without flinching. Patient, open. "I came here thinking I was just a man looking to prove himself on a difficult horse. But what I found—" He paused, struggling for the words. "What I found was a place where I remembered who I used to be. Before the war. Before I forgot how to want anything that wasn't about survival." Catherine reached across the space between them and took his hand. No hesitation. Her fingers were calloused, her grip firm, but her touch was warm and steady and sure. "You found yourself," she said. Jake shook his head, voice low and thick with emotion. "I found more than that." He looked at her, really looked at the strength in her jaw, the pain in her eyes, the kindness that had never left her, even when loss had tried to hollow her out. "I found you." The kiss that followed was as natural as the changing of the seasons, gentle, unhurried, and full of the quiet awe of something longed for, but never expected. And when they pulled apart, the stars had already begun to appear overhead, and somewhere in the pasture, Tempest let out a single low nicker that sounded for all the world like a blessing, a wedding, a witness, and a future. They married 6 months later. It was October, and the cottonwoods that framed the ranch were dressed in gold. The air held the crisp edge of coming winter, and the sky overhead was a polished blue that made everything beneath it seem sharper, brighter, more alive. The wedding was small, just a handful of neighbors, a preacher who'd ridden in from town, and a meal cooked over an open fire. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. Catherine wore her mother's dress, ivory silk with long sleeves and a modest neckline. It had been packed away in a cedar chest for decades, but she'd kept it in good shape. It fit her like it was meant for this very day. She wore a single strand of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother and tied her hair back with a ribbon the color of wheat fields at sunset. Jake had bought a new shirt, polished his boots until they gleamed. He stood tall on the porch of the ranch house, where they'd chosen to say their vows, his eyes fixed on Catherine like she was a sunrise he never thought he'd see again. But the most unforgettable moment came not from the preacher's words or the exchange of rings. It came from Tempest. As Jake and Catherine stood facing each other, just as the final "I do" left her lips, the black stallion trotted up to the edge of the corral. Behind them lifted his head high and reared onto his hind legs with a triumphant cry. The crowd gasped, then laughed, some wiping tears from their eyes. Catherine wept softly into Jake's shoulder, her tears warm against the morning chill. Not from sadness, from overwhelming fullness, from knowing that something long hoped for, something once thought impossible, was finally hers. They didn't ride off into the sunset. They simply walked down the porch steps together, side by side, hand in hand, as the people who loved them cheered, and Tempest paced the fence line like a guardian spirit, watching over their beginning. A legacy of trust. The years that followed weren't marked by drama or tragedy. There were no duels or disasters. Just seasons turning slowly, faithfully, like the gears of a well-built clock. Jake and Catherine worked the Sterling Ranch side by side, growing it with care and patience. Jake gradually took on more responsibilities, and it became clear to everyone who visited that the place wasn't just thriving, it was transforming. Together, they added new pastures, launched a breeding program, and built a reputation that stretched far beyond Dry Creek Valley. Tempest became the foundation of that legacy, not just a symbol, but a teacher. His foals inherited his intelligence, his strength, and somehow his need for real connection. Jake trained them all personally, using the same quiet, respectful approach that had won the stallion's heart. The horses they raised weren't just valuable, they were different. Known across the territory as responsive, courageous, and soulful, but the truest measure of what Jake and Catherine had built wasn't in land or livestock. It was in the people who passed through. 5 years after the wedding, a young cowboy rode into the yard with a limp in his step and a desperate look in his eyes. His horse was injured, his clothes patched, his pride ragged but still intact. "Name's Tom Bradley," he said. "Heard tell you might have work. I'm better with horses than I am with people." Jake and Catherine exchanged a look across the porch, one filled with memory and quiet understanding. They remembered what it meant to arrive with ghosts on your back and nothing in your pockets but hope. Jake stepped forward, extended a hand. "Well, Tom Bradley," he said with a grin, "I think we just might have exactly what you're looking for." And as the sun dipped below the hills that evening, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Tempest lifted his head from the pasture and called out once a sound that echoed through the valley like the voice of something eternal, a promise, a welcome, a legacy. Closing image, not the strongest, but the realest years. Later, folks still told the story of the day a cowboy named Jake Morrison rode the unrideable Stallion. They said it was a miracle, a stroke of luck, maybe even fate. But those who had been there knew better. It wasn't about magic. It wasn't even about skill. It was about truth. Jake stood on the porch of the ranch house one late afternoon, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. Beside him, Catherine leaned into his shoulder, her fingers laced with his, the quiet between them as full and rich as the summer sky above. In the pasture, Tempest stood beneath the cottonwoods, now older, but no less proud. His mane had grayed at the edges, and his movements were slower, more deliberate, but the fire in his eyes remained. Jake watched a group of young colts running in the lower field, the offspring of Tempest and mares hand-picked over years of careful breeding. One of them, a dark filly with a white blaze, bucked joyfully in the tall grass, her energy wild and free. Jake smiled. "You ever think Catherine said softly that all this came from one ride?" Jake shook his head. "No. All this came from listening, from choosing to stop pushing and start asking." She nodded. "That's what set you apart." He looked at her, the woman who had challenged 100 men with the truth of one horse, the woman who had risked her heart again when she had every reason not to. "You saw it before I did," he said. "I hoped," she replied. "But you proved it." They didn't speak for a while after that. There was nothing more to say. Everything important was already understood. And in the soft wind that swept across the valley, Jake heard it again, the truth he'd once forgotten, and now carried like a second heartbeat. In the West, they said only the strong survived, but Jake had learned otherwise. Sometimes it wasn't about being the strongest. Sometimes it was about being the most real. A place to belong, or a life well built. By the time the next spring rolled around, Jake was as much a fixture of the Sterling Ranch as the barn itself. He'd worn grooves into the land with his boots and into the community with his quiet, steady presence. People came from neighboring counties to buy horses, yes, but they stayed for the wisdom that had grown between Jake and Catherine, between them and Tempest, between everyone who passed through their gates. The cabin by the north pasture had transformed from a bachelor's refuge into a true home. Catherine's touches, fresh curtains, shelves filled with worn books, herbs hanging from the rafters, softened the edges. Jake added tools, bridles leather, and the scent of honest labor. It was a place of balance, a place where their lives met in the middle and built something lasting. Their days followed a rhythm that was both structured and free, early rides before the heat, long afternoons working cattle or tending fences, shared dinners on the porch as the sky burned gold. At night, they read to each other, sometimes in silence, sometimes aloud, stories, letters, poems that reminded them how far they'd come from the broken places they had once inhabited. Tempest still carried Jake across the fields, though their rides had mellowed into a kind of communion more than a challenge. Jake no longer needed to prove anything, and the stallion no longer needed to resist. They simply moved together like wind through sagebrush. And there were visitors, young cowboys, old horsewomen, troubled drifters with more questions than answers. They came to see the ranch, to learn from Jake, to ask about the stallion that wouldn't be broken but could be understood. And every now and then someone stayed. Someone earned a place. Because that was the legacy now. Not just horses, not just land, but a way of living, a way of being, a story that continues. In quiet echoes, time passed as it always does. The ranch changed with the years. Fences rebuilt, new foals, born old horses, retired to the upper pastures. Jake and Catherine aged with the land, not worn down by it, but deepened. Their love wasn't the fiery blaze of youth, but the kind that glows long into the night, slow-burning, reliable, true. Sometimes Jake would sit out at dusk, tempest, grazing nearby, and listen to the wind. He'd hear the echoes of that first ride, the breathless hush of the crowd, the rhythm of hooves on hard-packed dirt. The moment his hand first touched that black coat, and everything changed. And on quiet evenings, when Catherine slipped her hand into his and leaned against him, he'd remember what it felt like to be a man running from ghosts and what it meant to finally stop running. They never spoke about the legacy they were leaving behind. They didn't need to. It showed itself in the way the colts followed Jake without halters, in the way young cowboys treated animals with respect rather than force, in the way neighbors came to them not just for horses, but for hope. And though Tempest's muzzle had grayed and his pace had slowed, he remained the heartbeat of it all, the reminder of how everything began, of how one woman's challenge, one man's silence, and one horse's spirit created something larger than any of them alone. Sometimes at sunset, Tempest would stand at the top of the ridge and call out once, just once. Not in defiance, not in warning, but in acknowledgement, as if to say, "We did it. Together." And Jake would smile, tip his hat, and answer softly, "Yeah, we did." The ride that never ends. Long after the names had faded from the local papers, and long after most folks had forgotten the details of that famous ride, the story of the Sterling Ranch lived on, not in words, but in ways. In the gentle manner, a young rider laid a hand on a nervous colt. In the quiet respect exchanged between man and beast before the first saddle was lifted. In the way some still swore late at night that they'd heard the thunder of hooves under a full moon. No storm in sight, just a stallion running free across the ridgeline, his mane silvered with time, his soul untouched by it. Some said that kind of trust could only be born once, but others believed that when a man like Jake Morrison gave all he was to something real, when a woman like Catherine Sterling built a world on love not loss, when a creature like Tempest chose to be known not owned, then what they created didn't end with them. It echoed, it called, and somewhere out there beyond the hills a new rider might one day hear it and answer,